Stop pretending and cook the damn dinner. My mother said that barely 10 hours after surgeons cut my body open. The apron hit my chest. My stitches burned instantly. And my brother actually laughed while I struggled to stay standing. I remember looking at my father, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. The whole house smelled like pot roast and vanilla candles for a dinner party I was apparently still expected to prepare, even though I was still bleeding under my sweater. Then someone stepped into the doorway behind me, and suddenly, the room changed. My mother's face went white. My brother dropped the controller. My father looked like he forgot how to breathe, because the man standing behind me controlled the money keeping my family alive. And after hearing the way they treated me after emergency surgery, he was about to tear apart every lie they'd been hiding behind for years. But honestly, that moment wasn't the beginning. It was the explosion. The real story started long before that, inside a house where I slowly realized my family didn't love me like a daughter. They loved me like free labor. What hurt the most is that none of it happened overnight. People imagine toxic families as constant screaming, constant chaos. But my house didn't work like that. Most days it looked normal from the outside. We lived in this big 2-story house outside Nashville with white columns, trimmed hedges, and one of those long driveways my mother loved posting on Facebook every fall when the leaves turned orange. If you drove past our house, you probably would have thought we were one of those families hosting Thanksgiving dinners with matching napkins and awkward fireplace photos. And honestly, in public, we were. That was the strange part. My mother could smile through 2 straight hours at church without slipping once. Tyler suddenly became charming anytime guests showed up. Even my father knew how to sound warm when other people were watching. But inside that house, there was this quiet understanding that my job was to keep everybody comfortable while nobody asked whether I was okay. At first, I didn't even question it. My name is Hannah Bennett. I was 24 years old, and I'd spent most of my life believing good daughters helped. Good daughters cooked. Good daughters didn't complain when they were tired. And somewhere along the way, helping slowly became carrying everything. By then, my life had turned into one long cycle of exhaustion. I was in nursing school full-time at a community college about 30 minutes away, and most weeknights I worked evening shifts at a pharmacy just to pay for textbooks, gas, scrubs, and whatever new expense my parents suddenly decided was my responsibility now that I was an adult. Most nights I got home after 10 already exhausted. And every single time I walked through that front door, I already knew what I was about to see. Dishes stacked in the sink, grease drying on the stove, takeout containers across the coffee table, Tyler's soda cans lined up beside the couch like decorations, and my mother sitting comfortably at the kitchen island scrolling through shopping sales like the mess had magically appeared by itself. "Hannah, you forgot the counters." "Hannah, Tyler needs clean towels." "Hannah, did you leave laundry in the dryer again?" It was always my name. Always my responsibility. Tyler was 28 years old and somehow still allergic to accountability. He called himself a content creator, even though I never actually saw him create anything except noise. Most afternoons he sat upstairs yelling into a gaming headset while dirty dishes collected in his room like biology experiments. But somehow I was the lazy one if dinner was late. I still remember one night after a 12-hour clinical shift. My feet hurt so badly I could barely feel my toes. I still smelled like hospital disinfectant, and I hadn't eaten since noon. Before I could even sit down, my mother looked up from her phone and said, "Chicken's in the fridge. Start cooking before your father gets home." No hello. No, "How was your day?" Just instructions. And I remember standing there holding my backpack thinking, I don't think anybody in this house sees me as a person anymore, but I still cooked. Honestly, that's the part that embarrasses me now. I still cooked because keeping the peace had become automatic. My father said that phrase constantly. Just keep the peace, Hannah. What he really meant was, make life easier for everyone else. If my mother snapped at me, he stared at the TV. If Tyler mocked me, my father sighed like the conflict itself was inconveniencing him. And anytime I finally got frustrated enough to push back, suddenly I was the one creating tension in the house. So eventually, I stopped reacting. I swallowed anger, swallowed exhaustion, swallowed humiliation so many times it started feeling normal. And looking back now, I think that's the scariest part. Not the cruelty, the adjustment. People can adapt to almost anything if it happens slowly enough. I stopped asking for help because I already knew exactly what would happen. My mother would call me dramatic. Tyler would laugh. And my father would disappear into silence. There were nights I fell asleep still wearing my scrubs because I was too tired to change after cleaning the kitchen. Nights I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning studying anatomy flashcards while Tyler screamed at video games through the wall. And somehow, they still acted like I wasn't doing enough. The craziest part? If you'd asked me back then whether my family loved me, I probably would have said yes. Because when you grow up inside dysfunction, you stop measuring love by care. You measure it by how little trouble you cause. I think my body started warning me long before I was willing to listen. At first, it was just this dull ache low on the right side of my stomach. Nothing dramatic. The kind of pain you brush off because you don't think you have time for it. I blamed stress, bad coffee, too many vending machine dinners between classes and pharmacy shifts. Nursing students make terrible patients because we always think we can outsmart our symptoms. So I ignored it. I kept carrying laundry baskets, kept unloading groceries, kept standing over a hot stove every night cooking meals for people who barely looked up when I set the plates down in front of them. But little things started changing. I remember one night bending down to grab a pan from the lower cabinet when this sharp pain hit so suddenly I had to grab the counter to stay standing. My vision blurred for a second. Sweat rolled down the back of my neck. My mother looked over from the breakfast nook already annoyed. "Please don't start acting dramatic tonight," she said. "Your father's already had a stressful day." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Do you need to sit down?" Just irritation. A few minutes later, Tyler walked into the kitchen, grabbed a sports drink from the fridge, and smirked when he saw me leaning against the counter. "She's probably trying to get out of cooking," he said. Then he laughed. And honestly, I still remember that laugh more than the pain itself, not because it was loud, because my father heard it too, and stayed silent. That silence always messed with my head. It made me question myself. Made me wonder if maybe I really was weak. Maybe I really was overreacting. So I kept moving. That's what happens when people spend years teaching you your pain is inconvenient. A couple nights later, I burned a pot of rice because the pain got so bad I had to sit down on the pantry floor just to breathe through it. My mother picked up the pot like evidence in a courtroom. "One simple job," she snapped. "And somehow, you still make everything harder." And the worst part? I apologized. That's the piece that still stays with me now. Not the pain. The apology. Because even with my body practically begging me to stop, I was still more afraid of disappointing them than I was of something being seriously wrong with me. Looking back now, I think the night everything finally collapsed started long before the pain became unbearable. It started with this stupid handwritten list my mother left on the refrigerator. I can still picture it sitting there under those little sunflower magnets she bought from some boutique downtown. Her handwriting looked neat and careful, like she was planning a party instead of ordering around someone who could barely stand upright. Mop kitchen, wash guest towels, defrost dessert, take trash out, clean Tyler's bathroom, and at the bottom, underlined twice. No excuses. The house was empty when I found it. My parents had gone out to dinner and Tyler disappeared somewhere with friends. I remember standing there staring at that list while this deep, throbbing pain rolled through my stomach again. Only this time, it felt different, hotter, sharper. Like something inside me was twisting the wrong way. But I still tried to ignore it. Habit, I guess. I started with the trash because it seemed easiest. But halfway across the kitchen, the pain hit so hard my knees almost gave out underneath me. I grabbed the counter before I fell, and for a second, I honestly thought I might pass out right there on the tile floor. I remember breathing through my teeth, trying not to panic. The kitchen lights suddenly felt too bright. My skin turned cold and sweaty, and the whole house felt weirdly silent except for the refrigerator humming behind me. That's when the fear finally hit. Not embarrassment, not exhaustion, fear. I grabbed my phone and called my mother first. No answer. Then my father. Straight to voicemail. I even called Tyler, even though deep down I already knew exactly what would happen. He declined the call after 2 rings, so I sent a message in the family group chat. I think something's really wrong. I need help. I sat there waiting while another wave of pain tore through my stomach so hard I curled forward against the cabinets trying to breathe. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. My mother. "We're eating. Stop trying to pull attention." I stared at that message so long the screen dimmed in my hand. Then Tyler sent a laughing emoji. "If you can text, you can clean." I wish I could explain what that felt like. People think heartbreak only comes from screaming fights or dramatic betrayals. Sometimes it comes from realizing the people you would die for won't even pause dinner while you're begging for help. My father never replied at all. And honestly, that part still hurts more than I like admitting. Because somewhere deep down, I think I always believed he would eventually step in. That one day he'd finally look at everything happening and say enough. But he didn't. The pain got so bad after that, I couldn't stand up straight anymore. I ended up curled on the hallway bench near the front door trying to breathe without crying. And I remember looking around the house thinking how ridiculous it was that everything still looked normal. The vanilla candles, the throw pillows, the spotless dining room my mother cared more about than me. That's when I realized nobody was coming. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother. So with shaking hands, I opened the rideshare app and ordered a car to the emergency room. Because somehow, even then, calling an ambulance still felt like I'd be causing too much trouble. The rideshare driver took one look at me and asked if he should call 911 instead. And I still remember trying to say, "I'm okay," while I was folded forward holding my stomach like my body was trying to rip itself apart from the inside. He kept checking the rearview mirror the entire drive to the hospital, probably wondering if I was going to pass out in the back seat. Honestly, I was wondering the same thing. By the time we pulled up to the emergency entrance, I could barely get out of the car by myself. The fluorescent lights above the sliding doors looked blurry, and this wave of nausea hit me the second my feet touched the sidewalk. A nurse spotted me almost immediately. After that, everything moved fast. Wheelchair, blood pressure cuff. Questions I could barely answer between breaths. "What's your pain level?" 10, I whispered. And I still remember the look on the doctor's face when he pressed on the right side of my stomach. I cried out before I could stop myself. And something in his expression changed instantly. That's when I knew this wasn't stress anymore. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't me being dramatic. Something was actually wrong. Not long after that, the CT scan confirmed it. Acute appendicitis. Risk of rupture. Emergency surgery. I remember sitting there listening to the doctor explain everything while feeling weirdly detached from my own body, like he was talking about somebody else instead of me. Maybe because part of me still couldn't process the fact that I'd spent days apologizing for pain serious enough to send me into surgery. Before they wheeled me upstairs, I texted my mother. "I'm at the hospital. They're taking me into surgery." And honestly, I think some small part of me still hoped my mom would suddenly become a mother. Her response came while a nurse adjusted my IV. "Hannah, stop embarrassing yourself." A few seconds later, another message popped up from Tyler. "So, who's cleaning tomorrow?" I just stared at the screen. I don't even think I cried right away. I was too exhausted for that. Too numb. My father finally texted back a couple minutes later. Listen to the doctors. 3 words. No phone call. No, I'm coming. No panic. Just 3 words from the man who spent years watching me take care of everybody else. And I remember laying there in that hospital bed listening to the monitor beep beside me when this horrible thought suddenly hit. If I died that night, my family would probably still be angry dinner wasn't made. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia kicked in was staring up at those bright operating room lights, while a nurse quietly asked if there was anyone they should contact afterward. And after a long silence, I said, "No, I don't think so." When I woke up after surgery, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful quiet, hospital quiet, the soft hum of machines, rubber soles squeaking somewhere down the hallway, that sterile hospital smell that never really disappears, no matter how much coffee people carry through the building. My throat burned from the breathing tube, and my stomach felt swollen and tight underneath the bandages. Even moving a few inches in the bed sent pain shooting through my side. A nurse came in a little later and told me the surgery had gone well. She explained the discharge instructions slowly, probably because I still looked half asleep from the anesthesia. "No lifting over 10 pounds for a while," she said gently, "and you need real rest, okay?" Real rest. I almost laughed hearing that. Then she asked the question that cracked something open inside me. "Who's picking you up when you're discharged?" And I remember staring at her for a second too long. Because normal people usually have an answer to that question. A husband, a parent, a sibling, somebody. But all I could think about was my mother complaining about dinner while I was being prepped for surgery. My phone was sitting on the tray beside me. I reached for it slowly and saw 2 unread texts from her. The first one said, "Do not milk this." The second, "We still have guests coming Saturday." That was it. Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "Are you okay?" Just irritation that my medical emergency had become inconvenient for her schedule. I turned my face toward the wall because I could suddenly feel tears coming, and I didn't want the nurse watching me fall apart over something that probably sounded unbelievable out loud. But laying there in that hospital bed, still sore from surgery, something inside me finally shifted. For years, I kept telling myself my family loved me in their own way. But families who love you don't hear the words emergency surgery and immediately wonder when you'll start cleaning again. And that was the moment I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. They didn't care that I was hurting. They cared that I had temporarily stopped being useful. I think Rachel realized how bad things were before I did. She was the only person in nursing school who kept asking if I was sleeping enough. The only one who noticed I kept showing up exhausted, drinking coffee instead of eating lunch, rubbing my stomach when I thought nobody was paying attention. The morning after my surgery, she walked into my hospital room carrying a Starbucks bag and wearing that worried expression people get when they're trying not to panic for your sake. And I still remember how fast her face changed when she saw me. The IV in my arm, the hospital bracelet, the way I could barely sit up without wincing. "Hannah," she whispered. And honestly, hearing somebody say my name gently almost broke me more than the surgery did. Rachel set the bag down, pulled the visitor chair closer, and immediately slipped into caretaker mode. She fixed my blanket, adjusted my water cup, started asking questions the nurses somehow forgot to ask. "Have you eaten? When was your last pain medication? Did they explain the discharge instructions clearly?" It felt strange being taken care of, and weirdly enough, emotional. Because kindness starts feeling suspicious when you spend years surviving on criticism. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and instantly felt my stomach tighten harder than the stitches. "Mom." I almost ignored it, but Rachel saw my face and quietly said, "Answer it." The second I picked up, my mother's voice came through sharp and irritated. "Are you awake yet?" The kitchen still hasn't been cleaned, and Tyler says he doesn't have clean clothes. I closed my eyes. Mama, I just had surgery. There was this long sigh on the other end, like I was personally inconveniencing her. Hannah, every woman deals with discomfort. Stop turning this into a production. Rachel's head turned so fast I thought she was going to spill her coffee. And before I could even respond, she reached over and ended the call herself. The room went completely quiet after that. I remember staring down at the blanket, feeling embarrassed, even though none of it was my fault. That's what emotional conditioning does to people. It trains you to feel guilty for other people's cruelty. Rachel leaned back slowly and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. If this was one of our patients, she said carefully, and her family treated her like this after surgery, what would we call it? And honestly, I already knew the answer. Neglect. Emotional abuse. Exploitation. Words that sounded obvious in textbooks suddenly felt terrifying when they applied to my own life, and I think that was the first real crack in the illusion I'd spent years protecting. Because for the first time, somebody outside my family saw what was happening and didn't tell me I was overreacting. After Rachel said those words, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Neglect. Emotional abuse. Exploitation. I'd spent so many years defending my family that hearing somebody describe my life that plainly felt almost violent, like somebody finally turned the lights on in a room I'd been trapped inside for years. And that's when I thought about Grant Whitmore. Technically, he wasn't family. Not really. He'd known my grandmother for decades before she passed away, and after her death, he became the trustee managing a large part of the financial support tied to our household. My mother always talked about him carefully, the way people talk about someone powerful enough to change their life with one decision. Grant had this reputation around Nashville: former corporate attorney, investor, quiet, controlled. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. I hadn't spoken to him directly in years, but I remembered something he told me at my high school graduation dinner. We were standing near the buffet table while everybody else talked over each other, and he looked at me a second longer than most people ever did. If you ever truly need help, he said, call me yourself, not through your parents. At the time, I thought he was just being polite. But sitting there in that hospital bed with fresh stitches across my stomach and tears drying on my face, those words suddenly came back so clearly it almost scared me. Rachel must have seen something change in my expression because she quietly asked, "Who are you thinking about?" I hesitated before saying his name, and honestly, the look on her face told me even she knew who Grant Whitmore was. "You should call him," she said immediately. My stomach tightened the second she said it, because deep down I already understood something important. Calling Grant wouldn't just expose what happened to me. It would destroy the entire version of our family my parents had spent years trying to protect. Calling Grant turned out to be the moment everything changed. Honestly, I expected questions, doubt, maybe polite concern followed by distance. Instead, he listened, really listened. I told him about the surgery, the messages, the years of cleaning, cooking, and trying to earn love from people who only seemed happy when I was useful. And I remember my voice starting to shake halfway through the call because saying everything out loud suddenly made it impossible to minimize anymore. Grant stayed quiet until I finished. Then he asked one question. "Did your mother know you were going into emergency surgery when she sent those texts?" "Yes," I whispered. A long silence followed. Not awkward silence. Controlled silence. The kind that feels dangerous. Finally, he said, "Keep every message. Photograph your discharge paperwork. And don't warn them I'm coming." Even through the phone, something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Rachel heard it too. And somehow, despite everything, part of me still wanted to protect my family. That's the strange thing about people raised inside toxic homes. Even when you're drowning, you still worry about making the water uncomfortable for everybody else. A couple hours later, Grant walked into my hospital room. Tall, dark wool coat, calm expression, the kind of man who walked into a room and made people straighten their posture without understanding why. He didn't hug me or offer dramatic sympathy. He just looked at the bruising around my IV, the discharge bracelet on my wrist, and the way I struggled to sit upright. Then he said quietly, "I'm taking you home myself." The drive back to my parents' house felt longer than it really was. Rachel sat beside me in the back seat holding my medication bag while I pressed a pillow carefully against my stomach every time the car hit a bump. Nobody played music. Nobody talked much. Grant looked calm, but there was tension sitting underneath it, the kind that made the whole car feel colder. About 2 houses away from my parents' place, he slowed the car and parked along the curb instead of pulling into the driveway. I looked at him confused. He shut off the engine and said, "If they see my car first, they'll perform. I'd rather see the truth." And honestly, that sentence still stays with me, because performing was exactly what my family did best. From the outside, they were generous, respectable, church-going people. But inside that house, everything revolved around comfort, appearances, and control. Grant helped me out of the car, but let me walk toward the house first. Every step up the driveway pulled painfully against my stitches. Through the front windows, I could already see vanilla candles glowing inside the dining room. My mother hadn't canceled anything. Of course she hadn't. Guests mattered more than I did. And I remember standing at the front door thinking maybe, just maybe, seeing me pale, exhausted, and barely able to stand would finally wake something human inside them. It didn't. The second my mother opened the door, irritation crossed her face before concern ever could. "You're finally back," she snapped. "Stop pretending and cook the damn dinner." Those words hit harder than the surgery. She tossed an apron at me like pure muscle memory. It hit my chest and slid to the floor while pain ripped across my stomach so sharply I almost doubled over. Behind her, Tyler leaned against the hallway wall grinning. "I told you she was faking it." He laughed, and one last time I looked toward my father. Richard Bennett stood near the dining room entrance holding a glass of sweet tea, staring directly at my hospital bracelet. He knew. He knew I'd just come home from surgery. And he still said nothing. That silence hollowed something out inside me. I think my knees actually started giving out because Rachel grabbed my arm and said my name. But before I could answer, another sound cut through the hallway. Footsteps behind us. Slow, controlled. Heavy enough to make the old hardwood floors creak. Grant stepped into the doorway, and I swear the entire energy of the house changed in a single second. My mother's face lost color. Tyler dropped the controller. My father looked like somebody knocked the air out of his lungs. Grant glanced once at the apron near my feet. Then he looked directly at my mother and asked, very calmly, "Did you just order your daughter to cook dinner barely 10 hours after emergency surgery?" Nobody answered him. Not right away. The whole house just froze. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, the low murmur of guests lingering near the dining room. Somebody quietly setting down a wine glass in the kitchen like they suddenly realized they weren't supposed to be witnessing any of this. My mother recovered first. She always did. Her expression shifted so fast it honestly would have impressed me if I hadn't spent my whole life watching her perform for people. "Grant," she said with this shaky little laugh, "you're misunderstanding the situation." But Grant never even looked at her. His eyes stayed on me, on the hospital bracelet, on the way I was still holding my stomach just to stay standing. Then he bent down calmly, picked up the apron off the floor, and placed it on the hallway table like courtroom evidence. "I don't think I'm misunderstanding anything," he said quietly. And somehow, that quietness scared my father more than yelling ever could. I saw it immediately. Richard set his drink down so fast ice splashed over the rim. Tyler suddenly couldn't look anybody in the eye anymore. Grant stepped farther into the house and shut the front door behind him. The click of the lock sounded final. "Dinner is over," he said toward the dining room without raising his voice. "I suggest your guests leave." Nobody argued. That was the thing about Grant Whitmore. He never sounded controlling. He sounded certain. And certainty makes people obey faster than volume ever will. Within minutes, the whole house emptied in awkward silence. Chairs scraped across hardwood floors. Car doors shut outside one after another. My mother stood near the staircase, smiling tightly at guests as they left, pretending this was some small misunderstanding instead of the beginning of her entire world collapsing. The second the last car pulled out of the driveway, Grant turned toward my family. "Sit down." 3 words. That was all it took. My father sat immediately. Tyler hesitated until Grant looked directly at him, and then suddenly he sat too. My mother lowered herself carefully onto the couch, still clinging to this image of dignity she'd built her entire life around. Meanwhile, Rachel helped me into an armchair near the fireplace because standing hurt too much by then. Grant stayed standing. He pulled out his phone, connected it to the television above the fireplace, and suddenly the screen lit up with screenshots. My screenshots. The first one was my mother's text. "Do not milk this." Then Tyler's. "So who's cleaning tomorrow?" Then my father's message, "Listen to the doctors." And the room went dead silent. I'd already seen those texts, obviously, but seeing them blown up across that oversized television somehow made them look uglier, smaller, crueler, impossible to explain away. My mother tried anyway. "She's always been sensitive," she snapped. "You're taking private family conversations out of context." Grant clicked to the next image. My discharge paperwork. No lifting, no bending. Mandatory rest after laparoscopic emergency surgery. He read the instructions out loud slowly, almost clinically. Then he looked at Tyler. "You accused your sister of faking exhaustion after surgery?" Tyler shifted in his seat. "I didn't know it was that serious." Rachel actually laughed hearing that. "She had an IV in her arm," she said sharply. "What part looked fake to you?" Tyler turned red but stayed quiet. Grant moved on before anybody could recover. And honestly, I think the financial records scared my mother more than anything else. Pages of trust distributions, household expenses, grocery allowances, property maintenance payments, education support funds, and beside them, luxury skincare purchases, designer handbags, online shopping orders, weekend catering invoices, high-end furniture deliveries, thousands and thousands of dollars. My mother's composure started cracking right in front of us. "Those were household expenses," she said too quickly. Grant zoomed in on a receipt showing $1,500 spent on decorative lamps. "Necessary for survival?" he asked. Nobody answered. Then came Tyler's expenses. Gas cards, vehicle payments, phone bills, gaming equipment labeled under career development. Grant looked toward my father. "Would you care to explain how online gaming qualifies as professional development under the trust?" Richard rubbed both hands over his face, and for the first time in my life, my father looked small, not angry, not defensive, just weak. "Tyler said he was building a streaming business," he muttered. Grant clicked again. A spreadsheet filled the television screen showing Tyler's actual earnings from the past year. Almost nothing. Tiny deposits compared to the thousands being spent supporting him. "He's not building a business," Grant said flatly. "He's building dependency." That's when Tyler finally exploded. "Oh, come on," he snapped. "Why is everybody acting like Hannah's perfect? She lives here too. She should help around the house." And something inside me shifted hearing that. Maybe because for the first time, I wasn't scared anymore. I looked directly at him and said quietly, "Helping is when everybody carries something. What you wanted was for me to carry all of you." Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately, because the truth sounds different once you finally stop apologizing for it. My mother started crying next. Not real crying, strategic crying. the kind meant to regain control of a room. I was trying to raise her properly, she whispered. Girls need responsibility. Grant stared at her for a long moment. Then he said something I still think about even now. A daughter recovering from surgery is not a lesson in discipline. The room went silent again. She was in pain, he continued, and your first instinct was protecting a dinner party. My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the floor, and then Grant's voice got colder. This wasn't stress. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a system. He looked directly at each of them while he spoke. Susan demanded, Tyler consumed, Richard ignored, and Hannah paid for it physically. Nobody could deny it anymore, not with the messages, not with the records, not with me sitting there pale and shaking in an armchair after emergency surgery, while my family still somehow tried defending themselves instead of apologizing. Then Grant opened one final document. And that's when real panic finally entered the room. Effective immediately, he said calmly, all discretionary household trust accounts are frozen pending financial review. My mother's face lost all color. Tyler sat upright instantly. Grant kept going. The vehicle Tyler drives under the trust will be repossessed tomorrow morning. Fuel cards are canceled tonight. Phone expenses are terminated immediately. You can't do that, Tyler blurted out. Grant looked at him without blinking. I already did. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched the people who spent years controlling me realize they weren't in control anymore. The strange thing about consequences is that they usually arrive a lot quieter than the damage that caused them. Nobody screamed after Grant froze the accounts. Nobody flipped tables. Nobody stormed out of the room. The real panic started the next morning. I woke up sore and exhausted in my childhood bedroom, listening to my mother downstairs arguing with somebody from the bank. Her voice had that sharp, controlled edge people use when they're trying very hard not to sound desperate. Apparently, her trust card had been declined at a florist earlier that morning. Twice. I remember hearing her say, "There has to be some mistake," while pacing across the kitchen floor. But there wasn't. For the first time in years, money had stopped appearing every time she wanted comfort, decoration, or distraction. And somehow, the whole house felt different because of it. Quieter, smaller, more honest. Around 10 that morning, 2 men showed up to collect Tyler's SUV. And honestly, I think that was the first moment he realized Grant hadn't been bluffing. I watched from the upstairs window while Tyler stood barefoot in the driveway, yelling that the SUV was basically his because he'd been driving it for 3 years. One of the men calmly explained that making monthly payments and playing video games in the front seat were not the same thing as ownership. I almost laughed, despite the pain pulling at my stitches. Not because it was funny, because for once, reality had entered that house, instead of excuses. By lunchtime, Tyler had locked himself in his room, making angry phone calls, trying to find somebody hiring. My mother moved around the kitchen, opening cabinets over and over like she expected solutions to magically appear inside them. And every few minutes she'd glance toward the staircase, almost instinctively waiting for me to come downstairs and fix things. That realization hit harder than I expected. Even after surgery, even after everything Grant exposed, part of them still expected me to carry the weight of their lives. But this time, I stayed in bed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about it. Late that evening, my father knocked softly on my bedroom door. Softly. Like he finally understood I was a person instead of part of the furniture. When I told him to come in, he looked older somehow, more tired than I'd ever seen him. He stood there quietly for a long moment before finally saying, "I should have protected you." And the worst part? I'd wanted to hear those words my entire life, but sitting there with fresh surgical scars across my stomach, all I could think was, "You should have said them sooner." My father sat down slowly in the chair near my desk after that, like even his body felt heavier now. He kept rubbing his hands together while he talked. And honestly, I'd never noticed before how nervous he looked when there wasn't somebody louder in the room for him to hide behind. I thought staying quiet kept the family together, he admitted. I kept telling myself your mother would calm down eventually, that Tyler would grow up eventually. Then he looked at me, and I swear, that was the first truly honest look my father had ever given me in my entire life. But every time I stayed silent, he said quietly, it became easier to let you carry everything alone. That sentence hurt because it was true. People always talk about cruelty like it only belongs to the loudest person in the room, but silence can destroy people too. Slowly, quietly, over years. And I think my father finally understood something that night. By refusing to stop the damage, he had become part of it. A few days later, Grant helped me move into a small furnished apartment about 10 minutes from campus. It wasn't luxurious. No marble countertops, no giant staircase, no perfectly staged dining room my mother could show off online. Just a quiet little one-bedroom on the second floor with beige walls, an old ceiling fan clicking softly at night, and morning sunlight coming through the blinds in thin gold lines across the floor. And honestly, it felt more peaceful than that big house ever did. Rachel helped me unpack clothes and nursing textbooks while I moved slowly, still sore from surgery. Every few minutes she'd point at a box and say, "Don't lift that," like she was personally prepared to fight both me and the doctor if I ignored recovery instructions. And for the first time in years, people were telling me to rest instead of earn my place. That alone felt unfamiliar. Grant paid 4 months upfront directly to the landlord before he left. I tried arguing with him once, mostly out of reflex, but he shut that down immediately. "This is recovery," he said calmly, "not charity." Then he handed me a folder with copies of my medical paperwork, apartment documents, and emergency contact information organized neatly inside. And honestly, that small detail almost made me emotional. Because real care usually isn't loud, it's consistency. It's somebody making sure you won't have to panic later. The first night alone in that apartment felt strange. I kept waiting to hear my mother yelling my name from another room, kept expecting somebody to complain about dishes in the sink or ask what I was making for dinner. But nobody did. And the silence there felt different than the silence back home. Not cold, safe. I made myself a small bowl of soup, took my pain medication, and sat on the couch under this cheap throw blanket watching headlights move through the parking lot outside. And somewhere around midnight, something hit me so hard it almost hurt worse than the surgery itself. For the first time in my adult life, I was finally resting without feeling guilty for it. Once I moved out, the entire system my family built started collapsing faster than I expected. That's the thing nobody talks about enough with unhealthy families. Usually there's one person quietly holding everything together while everybody else takes credit for the stability. And in our house, that person had been me. Without me there, the cracks became impossible to ignore. My mother lasted less than a month before she had to leave the house. Grant gave her 2 choices: contribute financially or move somewhere she could actually afford herself. For years, she treated money like an endless stream that existed purely to protect her comfort. Suddenly, she had budgets, work schedules, real consequences. The first time she called me crying about standing 8 hours at a furniture store, I barely recognized her voice. Not because I hated her, because exhaustion sounded different once it finally belonged to her. Tyler struggled too. The second the trust stopped funding his lifestyle, reality hit him fast. No free SUV, no unlimited food deliveries, no constant gaming upgrades he kept calling career investments. Last I heard, he was working overnight shifts at a warehouse outside Nashville. And honestly, my father changed the most. He started therapy, started sending short texts every Sunday checking on me without pressuring me to answer. Sometimes I replied, sometimes I didn't. And for the first time in my life, the choice was mine. That mattered more than he probably realized. Meanwhile, I slowly started rebuilding a life that didn't revolve around surviving other people's dysfunction. I went back to classes, back to clinical rotations, back to sleeping through the night without listening for somebody yelling my name from another room, and little by little, I stopped feeling like a servant who escaped. I started feeling like a person again. Healing turned out to be a lot quieter than I expected. There was no big cinematic moment where everything suddenly stopped hurting. No dramatic speech. No instant forgiveness. Mostly, it was small things slowly starting to feel different over time. The first grocery trip where I only bought food I actually liked. The first Sunday morning I slept until 10 without guilt twisting in my stomach. The first night I left dishes in the sink and realized nobody was going to punish me for resting. And honestly, those little moments mattered more than revenge ever did. People think freedom always feels exciting. Sometimes it feels unfamiliar first, like your nervous system doesn't know what to do without constant tension holding it together. For months, every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened automatically. I still caught myself apologizing too much, still felt anxious sitting down while other people worked around me. That kind of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. But slowly, something inside me started changing. I stopped measuring my worth by how exhausted I was. Stopped believing love had to be earned through suffering. Stopped confusing self-sacrifice with goodness. And honestly, that realization changed my life more than grant-freezing bank accounts ever did. Because the real damage wasn't only what my family took from me physically, it was what they trained me to believe about myself, that my needs were inconvenient, that resting was laziness, that boundaries were selfish, that being loved meant being useful. But real love doesn't work like that. Real love notices when you're hurting. Real love tells you to sit down and heal. Real love does not hand a woman an apron while stitches are still holding her body together. I understand that now. And weirdly enough, I don't even tell this story because I hate my family anymore. I tell it because I know there are people listening who grew up the same way I did. People who became caretakers so young they forgot they were allowed to need care too. People who learned to survive by becoming useful. And if that's you, then listen carefully when I say this. You are not selfish for getting tired. You are not dramatic for needing help. And you are not weak for finally deciding your pain deserves to matter too. Because the real revenge was never watching my family lose control. It was finally understanding that I was never the weak one in that house to begin with. And I think that's the lesson I carry with me now. Not all abuse looks loud from the outside. Sometimes it hides behind family traditions, polite smiles, and the expectation that one person should quietly carry everybody else's burdens alone. The most dangerous kind of exhaustion is the kind we slowly learn to call normal. Real love is not measured by how much pain you can survive for other people. It's measured by care, respect, and whether somebody notices when you're hurting. No one should have to earn rest. No one should have to earn kindness. And sometimes healing begins the moment you finally stop apologizing for needing help.